Eureka is a word that originated in California. We are called the Golden State, and what that means was the thing that made California great back in the day was the gold rush in the 1800s. So when these gold rush drew people from all over the world, literally, and more within the United States, and when they came and they found gold, they would scream, Eureka, which means I have found it. And it really was the dream of every treasure hunter, because if you struck gold in the gold rush, it means that you can pretty much retire in life. It's like, your startup going for IPO or getting acquired by a Google or a Facebook, right? But people who came to mine for gold quickly learned that along with real gold, there is also what was called fool's gold. It looked just like gold, but it was not gold. And it was called pyrite. It's an iron ore, so the distinction was not very clear. So one way they would test it is to take it and bite it, because real gold is softer than our teeth and you can bite it. But iron pyrites, they're not, and they did not. True gold will leave a yellow streak when you scrape it, whereas the residue by fool's gold will leave a greenish black streak. So in either case, a miner wanted to make sure that it's real gold, and so he would do all sorts of tests to find out what is the truth, which is the real deal. Because if he found something that was not real gold and he left, his whole life literally depended on it, because they would spend years to do that. Truth like that is something very important for our lives. I had a friend who had cancer, but the symptoms started with very small aspects in their body. So when the person first went to the doctor would prescribe Tylenol, thinking that, it's just an inflammation, it will go away. And till the very end, did not diagnose it was cancer, and the person actually passed away. You see, finding out what is true is really important in all areas of our lives, because what we believe will affect how we live. What we believe will affect what we do and how we live. So here in this passage, we have a disciple of Jesus, someone who has been with him a long time. And Jesus made this incredible statement, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So if there is someone who knows about truth in a very intimate way, it is this person, John. And so he writes his letter from his heart to his dear friends. He calls them beloved in this passage. He says, I want you guys to know what is truth. I want you guys to know what is truth about God, what is truth about the world, what is the truth about yourself, and what is truth about life, and what is truth about death, and what is truth about life after death. Because when we know the real, true answers to these questions, we will live our lives very differently, isn't it? Truth matters. So it begins in this passage we just read in verse 1 and 2. He gives two direct commands to people whom he loves. The first command he says is, do not believe every spirit. By that he means don't be naive. Don't buy everything that people try to market to you as the truth. And the second command he gives is test all spirits. The word translated test, the Greek word, the original is dokimazoe, from which comes document. One thing I really hate is paperwork, but there are some people who love paperwork because it calls for very meticulous checking and analyzing and verifying facts. We have some real estate people in our church. I admire you guys, man, dealing with paperwork all the time. Because things have to be correct. If you just add 1 0 more, that's a problem. A zero can be a problem, right? And in fact, in those days, the term was used to refer to a metallurgist who was testing a metal for its purity. So John is saying, hey, even though you may be Christians, even though you may think you know the Bible, you know about Jesus, don't be naive. Test everything. Don't listen to everybody and whatever they say, test everything. See, Christianity is a rational faith. And that's something I love about it. It's so odd sometimes when we live in the Bay Area and you go and you work and you say you're a Christian, and people sometimes think you must be an idiot because they think, who believes in God these days? But the reality is that's not true. It's the most rational faith you can ever find anywhere else. It's an active faith. When God asks us to believe, He doesn't ask you to blindly believe that He exists. He gives us so many reasons. He gives us these creation, the reasons outside of us. He gives us reasons inside of us to see how everyone has a conscience. It's a very rational faith. So John is telling people, use reason, guys. Don't just blindly believe everything that comes your way. And then he gives 2 tests for one central truth about Christianity in verses 2 and 3. He says, this is how you can distinguish between what is truth and what is not truth. He gives some very, very simple tips. He says in verse 2 and 3, by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. That does not confess Jesus is not from God. That is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already. When he's talking of spirits, I'm sure some of you guys are thinking, well, we don't have spirits these days. This is some voodoo kind of stuff. But the real thing he's talking about is what influences us. There is an influence that will come from knowing the truth about Jesus, and there is an influence that we feel from the ones that claim they are against Jesus. And the central truth is this. The 2 major influences in the world are power and pleasure. The 2 influences of the Antichrist are power and pleasure. And the 2 influences of Christ are the exact opposite, weakness and suffering. If you have your bulletins, you can note that down. This is all I'm going to talk about today. It's just one point. What is the spirit of Christ and what is the spirit of Antichrist? The spirit of Antichrist is power and pleasure, and the spirit of Christ is weakness and suffering. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's just look around the world and our families and our faith. The world respects power and goes after pleasure. We live in the tech digital world, right? In the past 10, 15 years, the world has changed dramatically. And I was looking at this picture that went viral on Facebook. It talks about what happens in 60 seconds in the digital world. So in 60 seconds, nearly 300 million messages are exchanged across people. Thousands and billions of thousands of dollars are spent online. A real virtual world has been created that is shaping people's lives and gives us a sense of power. So now today, people have gotten used to this new technology world that we have created, that a new God has emerged amidst us. And it's the God of technology that people worship. It's not Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. And the majority of people who live in the Bay Area, they are categorized as nuns, as like we don't believe in anything, because they actually worship this technology. You know, Elon Musk has told us that he's going to put people in Mars in a few years. You know, he's talking about the Hyperloop that's going to take us in 20 minutes from San Francisco to LA. You can buy stuff from your cell phone by one click, pushing just that button that has made Jeff Bezos one of the richest guys in the world right now. When you have all these things in your fingertips, it gives you a sense of power, isn't it? So now there is no need for God because technology has power. We believe technology will cure all our problems. Hey, I'm sick. I can go to Stanford or, the best medical facility that's out there and that'll take care of me. But I've been to Stanford, inside intensive care units, where people are dying and medicine is not able to solve that. And at that moment, people would want all the prayer they need in the world to see if their loved one can be saved. But we buy this. Whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, if you live in the Bay Area, that's the bait, man. It's a bait and switch. We buy it. And because we buy it, we try to seek to get the same power, whether it's money power or power at work. And so we seek to work at jobs that pay these big bucks and are willing to even stay disconnected with what we are really passionate about and what we really care about. We're willing to put those things aside because we want this power. And it just doesn't stop with power, isn't it? Now, I've worked in a few tech companies in the Bay Area. I know how life is. Well, you work hard and you party hard. So Monday to Friday, you work hard, right? 14 hours a week, 16 hours a week. And Friday evening, come the crates of beer and they open it up in your office because you're supposed to party, because that's what the life purpose is. For you to work hard is so you can have pleasure. So you see, power and pleasure is the spirit of the Antichrist you and me experience every day in the Bay Area. You may think, all this spirit stuff happens in some jungles, maybe in some remote parts of India or Papua New Guinea. But you are actually experiencing it every day when you go to work. Power and pleasure. And so he says, you know what Jesus Christ is all about? He's about weakness and suffering. Because he came in the flesh. What does it talk about? What does it mean that Jesus Christ came in the flesh? It talks about how he comes as a weak baby without even a home to parents who are not even married and who are on the move. There's nothing powerful about that. There's nothing pleasurable about that. Contrast that to the world. San Francisco has changed in the last 10 years. It's drawing scores and scores of young millennials who are drawn to the city because of the booming startups like Twitter and Lyft and all these things that are taking over the world, and the opportunity for pleasure. We happened to witness that as young adults. We went for a trip last Christmas. There's the whole SantaCon event. If you guys don't know what SantaCon is, where everyone gets dressed up with a Santa's hat. It's basically pub hopping throughout the night, where everyone can get drunk as much as they want and get as much pleasure as they want, no questions asked. That's what draws people. I want to go to a city that gives me power and pleasure. Why would anyone want to come to Jesus who has nothing attractive about him? He's born like a baby in a manger to parents who were not even married and don't even have a house. His entire life was about weakness. You could never see him hang out with the most powerful and the who's who in town. He was always hanging out with the messed up people. He would do miracles to heal those people. He would do life-changing messages to those people. And even when he finally comes, when people love him, he doesn't come riding on a horse like a king. He rides on a donkey. Who rides on a donkey? When you try to enter into a city to attract people to follow you. If you want followers on YouTube and Facebook, that's not how you get it. But that's who Jesus was. He's about weakness, man. That's the Spirit of Christ. And let's look how this plays out in our families. I was looking up the demographics in the United States, and they found that Asians, in particular, are the highest earning ethnicity in the entire United States right now. And among the Asians, guess who topped the list? Indians. Indians are the number one richest ethnic group in the entire United States. The average salary of an Indian household is $100,000. If you're making less than that, you're considered poor among Indians in the United States. But that also gets to us somehow, isn't it? Because most of the Indians who've come here, they're the best, they are the brightest, and they work hard, they're dreamers, they go after things, and we accomplish very well. But then, we begin to pass that on to our children. We start looking at children through the same grid of power and success. One of the biggest reasons, both Indians, Koreans, Chinese, all of them, they're very successful. One of the reasons why the second generation leave the church among the ethnic churches is because of this. Parents and people in general look at kids through this lens to give them a sense of identity. The first thing an adult comes and asks is, hey, how are you studying? What are your grades? How is school? And that breaks their heart. And if they don't end up going to some of the top schools and end up in a community college or take a break, they are like, okay, you're useless, man. What? Look at you. Look at me. I came with $10 in my pocket to this country, and I now have $1 million home. And you grew up with all this, and look at you. You suck. See, we got that. That's the spirit of Antichrist working right inside our home. And we sometimes forget how many of us went to Ivy League schools growing up at the age of our kids doing what they're doing, right? I think we all turned out okay, even from a very logical sense. We had Pastor Joey's wife speak to our women a year ago, I guess, in the Women's Fellowship. She is the dream success story, went to Stanford, I guess Berkeley after that. Now she works in Intel. She heads a division that advises the CEO of Intel. You think of success, she's the picture-perfect model of success, and yet she was with these women, opening her heart and say how her life was so pathetic because it was all driven by success. And she had to wrestle with so much mental trauma to come to terms with who she really is. So how about the next time you meet some of our kids? Instead of asking them, how was school? You ask them, how are you? Instead of asking them, how are their grades? You ask them, hey, how's your walk with God? Instead of asking them, hey, where are you going to go next? Ask them, what are you struggling with in life? How can I help? That's the spirit of Antichrist. Or if you're young and if you're choosing schools at this time, what is your criteria? Are you looking at the same thing that your parents may have knowingly or unknowingly dumped on you? I want to choose the best and the greatest, which is not wrong in and of itself if it's done for the right reason. But if that's where you think you get power and recognition and identity, maybe you want to rethink about that. What are the reasons why you are choosing what it is? Because Jesus came for the exact opposite of that. See, power not only affects our world and work and our family and our homes, the spirit of the Antichrist. I'm just trying to map this out for us. in very practical ways. It even affects faith as Christians. The last 30 years or so saw the emergence of a new brand of Christianity. It's actually called prosperity gospel. It's about power. And what it teaches is, there's one of the big proponents of it, I have no problem telling him, Joel Osteen. He has a huge mega church in Texas. He fills an entire stadium because his basic theology is suffering is bad. Weakness is wrong. You're supposed to be successful and you're not supposed to suffer. And there were people before him who started this. They're called the televangelists. I know, a side note, when I first came to the U.S., I saw a picture of the U.S. map in the refrigerator in my workplace. And they had, like in California, they said earthquakes. They rounded up as earthquakes. Florida, they rounded it as hurricanes. You can't go. Then the entire Northeast and the North, they just circled it and said, it's an ice box because they get snow pretty much 6 months a year. Then in the center of the U.S., they rounded it, said it's tornadoes, so no one can go live there. And then below that, they marked the southern part of the United States and said televangelists. And they said nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But guess what? Like McDonald's, this gets exported to other parts of the world too. So you can find televangelists in India, televangelists in Africa, televangelists in South America, and all the poor countries. They sell very well because people are poor. If you go and tell a poor person, God is going to take away all your loans, they're going to come follow you. And people flock to them because that's called power encounter. When you share about Jesus, there are two things. There is a power encounter and a truth encounter. There is a power encounter because in many of those places, people are sick. People are literally under the influences of evil spirits. So you do need to show demonstration that Christ is supreme. And guess what? He does that with ordinary people. You can go and tell them about the love of Christ, pray for them. People do get healed. You don't need a superstar guy to come and do that. Wearing a coat or nowadays even wearing a shirt. But there's also a truth encounter. And that is where the problem is. What are you telling us that is the gospel? See, the problem is these people, it says, they went out from the church. First of all, most of these guys don't even belong to a church. They have their own thing. They call it this ministry and that ministry. So there's no accountability, right? You can say whatever you want and get away with it. I was listening to some of these televangelists from India, and every year they give this prophecy for the year. Okay, this is what God is going to do this year. Well, they found out in the last few years it's not working out. Because nowadays, you can pretty much see the video and you can check, hey, did it actually happen? So then they got together and they came and made a video and said, we want to extend the expiry date of our prophecy. We said 1 year, but actually God takes 3 to 4 years. So it's actually not this year. It could happen in 3 or 4 years. We know that. We know every 3-4 years there will be storms, there will be earthquakes. But people flock. They believe them blindly because they are promising and promoting a gospel of prosperity and not weakness. A gospel of power and not suffering. But the gospel of Jesus Christ is about weakness and suffering. You see, that's the spirit of Christ and the Antichrist at work in the world, in our very homes, and even in our faith. And he says, watch out for them. And how do we know these guys? He said, by their fruit. First, they'll have no financial accountability, right? And they get embroiled in large financial fiascos, and that brings everybody down. But the ones God uses, most of the time, the people whom God used to change the world were nobodies. God takes nobodies and makes them somebodies in His kingdom. If you think you're somebody and you come to Jesus to make you an even better somebody, and someone says, I can do that, that's the spirit of the Antichrist. But if you feel, hey, I'm a nobody, my life is messed up, I know my heart, it's messed up. I don't think my career is going anywhere. I don't even know what I want to do next. I feel so weak. I feel that I fail God every single day in my heart, in my conscience. If you think you're a nobody, then maybe God can and will use you to be a somebody, maybe even if it's not in this world but in heaven. Because look at Jesus. And then he gives us the assurance. He says, little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. Isn't this an amazing word? How do we deal with these influences that we are bombarded with every day, that the world keeps pushing into us, and we take the bait, it's the bait and switch. You buy into the power and pleasure thing, and then you find actually your life is so messed up. You don't get the pleasure you want, nor is it actual power, because if the stock market crashes, you're wiped out. And it has happened to people. He says the real way to do that is if you have this Jesus in your heart. This Jesus who came so weak, so he can take our weakness upon himself, so he can let himself to suffer and die on the cross. When this Jesus resides in our heart, that's powerful. He will help you to not buy in to this power, pleasure mantra the world keeps throwing at us. And so you can, whenever you're faced with this crisis, you can say, he who is in me is greater than he who is in the world. He is my power. And as the word says, when I am weak, then I am strong. That's the message of Christianity, my friends. The Jesus who is in us will strengthen us in our weaknesses. He doesn't say you're not going to be weak. In fact, he says that through your weakness, I'll make you strong. He doesn't say your life will not have suffering, but he says in your suffering is when I will transform you and make you a man and a woman of godly character. And therefore, rejoice when you have suffering. Try preaching this televangelists and see how many people you get. You know, there is, and you see this actually at work in the world all the time. CNN gives this, Hero of the Year every year, right? You guys have probably seen that on TV. And in 2017, they gave the Hero of the Year award to a girl named Mona Patel. Anyone followed that? Anyone knows the story? You know, Mona Patel, she was 17 years old, one of the Cal girls. She was walking to class at Cal Poly University. I guess that's San Luis Obispo. Do they call it Cal Poly, the San Luis? Yeah. So she was walking to class at Cal Poly when a drunken driver slammed into her, and she was 17. And she says, I flew up about 12 feet, and then he pinned me between his car and a metal railing, and that's what smashed my leg and my foot. You know, Mona's body and her future changed forever right at that very moment. You know, weeks later, when Patel got out of the ICU, she underwent her first amputation. She's this beautiful-looking girl, and you see her that she's lost one of her limbs first. And it was not the end. It was the beginning of 7 years of surgeries in attempts to salvage the rest of her other leg. But during this time, Mona Patel, she went on to earn a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degree, and she became a social worker. Her dreams changed. What she went to do in school shifted, and now she had a new dream. Along the way, Mona continued to struggle physically with her disability. She struggled to also find a support group for amputees. And in 1997, with the prospect of another amputation, she was going to lose her other leg, she made a promise. She vowed that once I get back on my feet, I will start some support group for amputees like me. And she did. Her nonprofit, the San Antonio Amputee Foundation, it aims to help amputees rebuild their lives. This group offers peer support, education, recreation opportunities, as well as financial help for basic home and car modifications and prosthetic limbs for people who have lost their limbs. And she says every month 30 to 60 amputees get together to share stories and testimonies of strength and resilience. And Mona estimates more than 1,000 amputees have attended her meetings so far. She says when someone becomes an amputee, imagine you lose your legs all of a sudden. Maneuvering to the system is sometimes very scary. So she doesn't have her limbs below her knees. I think the big catalyst of me doing what I do to help the amputee community is because I lived it. When you suffer is when you have a heart for others who suffer. She just didn't live it and go through it with life. She overcame it, and this is where God gave her the strength, I believe. She leads health and fitness programs and sponsors amputees to participate in tennis tournaments and endurance climbs. And here's the kicker. In 2015, Mona led a group of amputees to climb to the peak of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. Isn't that awesome? How many of you have climbed Mission Peak? With our limbs. We know what we are talking about. I can tell you lots of interesting stories about Spectrum Mission Peak experiences after the church. But imagine this. She didn't just do it herself. You know how it feels when you get to the peak? It's a very hard climb, right? But then you get to the peak, you're like, wow, this was worth it. But imagine people without limbs being able to do that, what it does to them. For 1,000 people to have that experience, it meant she had to lose her limbs. That is the Spirit of Christ, my friends. That is the Spirit of Christ. That is what God will do through you and me using our weakness and suffering. He'll make something really beautiful come out of that. Bhakt Singh was a man who came from a Sikh background. He came to do his education in Canada, and he came to know about Jesus, surrendered his life. As soon as he did that, his entire family ostracized him. They said, we don't want anything to do with you. So he goes back because he wants to serve the people he came from, ends up in Bombay, in the streets of Bombay without a single penny. He lives on coffee donated by people who walk past him for several days. And through that experience shares the love of Jesus and ends up starting a church which became a movement. And it is one of the largest indigenous church planting movements in India with hundreds of churches all around. One of their core values is simplicity, weakness, suffering. They intentionally underpay their pastors because they want their pastors to experience suffering and humility. Now beat that, televangelists. You guys have heard of Creflo Dollar. He wants his own private jet plane and raised $55 million, and people were stupid enough to pay him that. That's the spirit of Antichrist, and to me, this is the spirit of Christ. May that be our spirit. He says, if you have this Jesus in your heart, you will not take the bait of power and pleasure. You will love to endure weakness and suffering. And that is what he says, that those who have Jesus will love this. And I want to leave you thinking about these things. If you are working, think about why you do what you do. What problem is your work solving? Is this a dear thing to your heart? Is this something you're passionate about? You just have one life to live. if you spend your prime of your life doing something you hate just for the sake of getting a paycheck on the table, and then you realize, you think, oh, after I retire, I'll do what I love, I don't think you'll have the energy to do that. Think about your faith. Are you still drawn to all these antichrist, power, pleasure-driven televangelists? Please stop. First of all, they will not be there when you go through a crisis in your life. You know who will be there when you go through a crisis? It is a no-name buddy of yours in your own church, probably right here, who will walk with you, who will pray with you, who will help you deal with that. Ordinary, weak people who have gone through suffering are the best ones to help someone who suffers. And in your own family, as you're contemplating school for your kids maybe, or if you guys are in that place thinking about what job or what school to do, have you explored as a challenge? If God is calling your children to be missionaries or pastors even, is that even a profession that crosses your mind as a radar? I can honestly tell you, maybe not, for many. What are the metrics you have to really choose a college? You know, in work we used to call the left column mentality, which is like you sit in a meeting, everyone has their agenda, but no one is talking the real deal, right? Everyone's playing it technically right, but the real agenda is in the left column. What's in your left column? God sees that. He knows that, What about a career in social work, maybe? Or if you think, I want to be an engineer or a scientist, why? Is it because that will give you a life of power and safety and pleasure and security? Or is it because you think you're going to solve a problem in the world? That is how truth will impact us. What you believe about truth will impact all these areas in our lives. And if we choose the path of weakness and suffering that will enable us to rely on Christ, we will be unshakable in our journey. Let's pray.